back out on the frame. It's another rainy day, so it's a good day to spend it inside the shed. You notice the Land Rover is out because obviously I'm doing woodworking, so there's sawdust and crap everywhere, so it's parked outside. I'd like to say I'd fixed all the leaks in it, but no, apparently not. Still leaks. And also the headliner that I glued up is already coming down in a few places where I don't think I used quite enough glue. So may have to pull all that down again for another look. The leaks aren't as bad as they used to be. As far as I can tell, it's leaking around the rear sunroof now. And I think it's actually leaking under the sunroof, around the outside edge of the sunroof possibly. So that's something to look at. One thing I did do though is somewhere here, I've sealed around the Alpine windows, which had a little drip, with some of this stuff, which is creeping crack cure. So it's a sealant, but it's very thin, so it wicks into all the joints. I believe they use this on boats and things like that. So I may try putting some of that around the outside edge of the sunroof. You can actually see where there's a bit of a gap there, and it probably shouldn't be, but that's okay. It's not leaking anywhere near as much as it used to, so that's fine. Project for another day. Somebody left a good comment about the last film. I'd mentioned that the aluminium doesn't need to touch the wood very tightly everywhere, and they said it probably should. This gets interesting. So on my steel-bodied Austin, or steel frame rather, the aluminium doesn't actually touch the frame in a lot of places, and it doesn't need to. So for example, all around the sides there, those tubes, there's a gap, and the aluminium skin is easily strong enough. I mean, there's some flex in it, but it doesn't need the frame there to support it. It's only where it's wrapped around. You can see where it gets wrapped around that top tube. And when we made this, actually, Josh said to me, oh, we didn't need that top tube at all. This could have all been a wired edge, which would have made it a little less sort of chunky, a lot finer edge. As it happens, the chunky look suits it. It didn't really matter too much. I did go a little bit wrong there. Should really stop pointing out my own flaws. But on the Riley frame, because it's timber, I don't know if that means it's going to be different or not. But what I was kind of meaning was, you don't have to shape all of the timber to match the curve of the aluminium. And you actually see this on the originals. And this is kind of what I mean. So this is a perfect example where there's going to be a massive gap here, because this gets bolted down, but there's no need to make this fit all the way out and smooth it round, because the aluminium will fit in like that once I trim that bottom corner, and that'll be plenty strong enough. And when you actually look at the frame, most of the timber that's there is to provide an edge. So if you look at the front section, you can see this is the edge for the top of the door. This is the door pillar. Same in here. This is the front of the firewall. This is the base down here. The only one where it isn't really doing much is this, but you need this to keep the two halves separated. But this is an example of where, I mean, you'd have to be really careful that this isn't sitting up too high. In fact, I'm almost inclined to bevel these edges here, because the problem is, if this was proud at all, when you pull all this down, you can see underneath the metal where the line is. So you just have to be careful of that. But it was a good comment, and now actually when I look at it, almost every piece is something that the aluminium gets wrapped around. It gets a little interesting at the tail. So the hoop that goes there, that one I think does have to be really nicely shaped, because the aluminium will be up against that. But even then, I don't really know that it has to be right up against it. It has to be close, of course, but I'm not sure. We'll see when we get there. Same as the back here. You know, this piece does continue up. There's going to be a rail along here, but I will try and shape it as carefully as I can, of course. What I'm doing right at the moment, and the reason I stopped to film this, is because it's quite interesting to see. I didn't want to forget. I've cut out the pieces for the tail. I call this the tail floor, and I've done it in two pieces that get joined with one of these little splices. And I wish this had occurred to me sooner, but because these are timber joints, everything has to be tight. You don't want any gaps, because I'm using a wood glue. You want the gaps as tight as possible. So I've been cutting these and then trimming them to fit. So this length here fits into this piece of timber. And then it occurred to me, all I actually need to do, and I have done this now, is set my depth on my bit here. This is unplugged at the moment, to be the same as the width of my steel rule. And then when I trim these pieces, I can fit one piece in nice and hard, and all I have to do is lay this on, and then I can trace the line, and that'll give me the exact length that I need to trim this to, so it fits tightly into here. It's one of those things which, once it occurred to me, it seems really obvious, and I don't know how I missed that in the first place. But what I have been doing, like on this one, is measuring it, drawing a line, cutting the line fat, and then using the linisher to accurately sand it down till I get a perfect fit. But I think doing it this way with the ruler and just scribing it and cutting it will be much, much quicker and easier. The funny thing is, I've discovered that after I've already done pretty much most of these that I'm going to need to do, I think. But if anyone else is doing it the same way, that saves time. Oh, the other thing, when I first started doing this, again, it was me being a little bit too accurate, and I was worried about my little jig not having the bit correctly in the middle of the piece of timber. So if you imagine this is slightly off center, it'll cut either high or low, and I was getting around that by cutting one side, then flipping the piece over and cutting the other side. You might be able to see it's not perfectly in the middle, but it's very close. But what I realized is that doesn't matter. As long as it's mostly in the middle, just cut from one side, because by flipping it upside down like that, the slot ends up bigger, of course. It doesn't end up the width of the cutter. And I specifically chose a 10mm cutter to give me a third of the width of the timber, because these are 32mm thick. It's just what it was playing to, the boards. That's what I was able to get. Which made cutting these little joiners more difficult. So I had, by making sure this is exactly 10mm, I'm able to set up the fence on the bandsaw so I can cut these exactly 10mm thick and get them to join nicely together. It's quite a nice tight push fit. So that's another example of trying to be too accurate by getting the slot in the middle, making things way more difficult than I needed to make them. This is the first time I've done this. I'm kind of learning as I go. I don't think I'll ever do another one, so it's worth saving these little findings and tips, putting them up here so that maybe somebody else who ends up doing this can learn from them. But I don't know if this is the best way to do it. I don't know if anyone should be copying this as an example, but it's working out for me so far. This is just to show how I glue and clamp these things together. I really like these. I don't even know what they're called. They're special woodworkers clamps, but because they've got two screw threads, you can clamp down parallel on things, and so I can get really strong clamping force across all of the glue joint using these. And this is just a piece of baking paper. It's greaseproof paper, I think. There's baking paper and there's greaseproof paper, and they're two different things. What I really want is waxed paper, and I don't even think you can get that anymore. I haven't found it for a while. It's all not real wax. You used to be able to get real waxy paper, sandwich wrap type stuff, but I don't know if you can actually still get it. I remember in primary school, I think, there was a thing you used to do with leaves where you got two sheets of the waxy paper, put it with the wax on the inside, and you put leaves and things in between them, leaves and flowers, and then you could iron the outside and it would melt the wax and seal everything in. But I'm guessing you can't do that anymore because you can't get actual paper with wax on it. It's some sort of synthetic-y stuff. Anyway, it's a bit off topic. But the other thing worth mentioning is, I mentioned it before about how the joints in here have to be really tight, but a fraction of movement in here can actually make quite a big difference in where these two ends sit. So I guess like all woodworking and metalworking projects, you end up measuring a lot. So what I have to do in this case is I measure across the chassis rails and I know the width, and when I glue all of this up, I check that my measurements across here are accurate, because you can easily be half an inch, 3/4 of an inch off at this end if your joint at this end isn't quite correct. And of course it gets worse the longer the pieces of timber are. These are probably the longest pieces that I'll have. Possibly the bits along the front, under the front section, were slightly longer. But then you can also see one of the difficulties in trying to do this on a car which is a rolling chassis. So obviously this car works, everything's in place, the suspension's where it should be, everything is where it needs to be. Obviously I've driven it around, so it must all be complete. The difficulty then is you have to measure around things. So, for example, trying to get a measurement across the middle of the body there with the rear axle and torque tube in place, is nearly impossible. My gimbal's having problems. I think the battery's almost flat on it. But this is another example. That's why my measurement lines on that rear tailpiece was actually an inch back, because I can't get in there to measure directly across. In a few places I've resorted to using pieces of string or wire that I string across, because the wire is very thin. Obviously it's a lot narrower than a tape measure or a steel rule, and I make marks on the piece of string and then measure those, or use the string directly. Yeah, I thought I'd just mention that. And this glue dries pretty quickly, but I prefer to leave it overnight to be really certain that the glue's set. So this is the rear tailpiece, which kind of goes in there. So that'll sit in there. And I think this is just about to die, so I'll stop now. Ended up having a big cleanup. Every so often I have to stop and vacuum up all the sawdust and clean everything and make sure I've still got everything. These are all glued up, waiting to dry. These end pieces I've just glued little blocks on. I did think about sort of doing a lap joint or something fancy there to stick these bits together, but it just needs to fill a space. It doesn't have to be structural, just that little corner. So I just glued a little block on. If I was going to sort of lap it in, this is a curve, so you'd have to cut that on a curve, and it was all a bit complicated. So it's just glued in place. The rear, I've cut these rear verticals, so this is the rear off the opening around the axle. Again, this is where everything is kind of on strange angles. So you can see this is directly across the car, but because the chassis rails angle in, I've actually set these, instead of being parallel or perpendicular to the axis of the car, I've actually lined them up with the chassis rail, because that means there'll be less I have to take off the timber, if that makes sense. because now it's sort of sitting more flat to the sides of the car, and it also makes it easier to fit the horizontal pieces that go in here because they'll just be square on the ends. If this was angled like this and this is angled like that, you would then have to cut the straight piece with angles on the side, and I think this is pretty much how it was in the originals. This is one of those details. I've got lots of photos of the inside of the cars, but it's really hard to actually see the details because they're inside the car. And I think often the photos are taken with wide-angle lenses and things, so you can see everything, but it distorts everything as well. I'm just doing it the way I think makes sense and seems most sensible. There are a few minor differences between mine and original. So on an original, there's a piece of steel strap that effectively goes along there, up and across and then down, but it's got a little step in it because the bottom rail is thicker for some reason. I've just done mine flush. I don't know if that means I've made these too thick or that too thin, but it should all still work. It also means making those metal brackets will be much easier because they're effectively flat. So that's the other reason I've done it this way. So when these are in place, because these are both on the same piece of chassis rail, it's more or less straight along there. I think it's supposed to be straight. But because there's a little kink under the axle there may be a little bit of a bend in it, but it means these vertical faces are parallel to each other. So when I make the metal strap, it's just a simple flat piece that I have to make. And that basically reinforces all the way around there and gets screwed into the timber. So I had to cut the angles on those. Again, this is where everything is now becoming a matter of angles, getting everything correct. So you can see because the chassis rail kicks up here, you can't see from above. If you get further down, you can see that it, because the chassis is so low, it sort of comes along, sinks down and under. There's kind of a V shape there. So I had to work out the angle that I need to get these vertical to the ground. And I used my little, I've put it away now, my little angle finder, one of those little square boxes that measures angles. And I used the timber across there because that's horizontal, that's parallel to the ground. I used that as my 0 reference and measured the angle of this, which works out to be about 5.5, 6 degrees. Good thing is it's the same on both sides. That's always important, making sure everything is equal. So eventually there will be another piece of timber that goes across the top of these, joins onto the back of the seat rail and joins on at the tail. And again, that's going to need to have angles cut on it, and that's going to get a little bit tricky. That's effectively going to have to be sort of hand fitted. And it's in my model to get the plane that I used for there, I did actually use these as reference points. So you can create a plane through 3 points, and I was able to say, put a point here, a point here, and a point here, and it creates a plane through those points. Actually, I used the front point here and a point here and a point here because then the plane cuts a little bit off the back edge of these, if that makes sense. So if this is angling down, it goes like that, so you lose this back corner. I think what I'll have to do is I'll be able to get the profile of that, and then I can do what I normally do, cut that out or print that out on paper, 1:1 scale, glue it onto the timber and cut it out. That'll give me a flat piece, and then if I sit that on top of here, it's going to rest on the highest edges, and I can measure the gap between this edge and the top, and that's the gap you get there is how much you have to take off here, if that makes sense. That's my plan anyway, so hopefully that'll all work out. So it's the next evening out in my shed again with a couple of little helpers. I've been working on the tail, so the bottom piece is all now nicely glued up. I've trimmed around the end where I joined the 2 pieces, and I've got that sat on the chassis where it needs to go. In order to get it to fit, I actually had to sort of counter bore or drill 2 holes in the bottom of this because there's actually a rivet like these in the top here. that holds this rear tube to the chassis. So I had to drill a little hole so it would actually sit down over that rivet. That worked really well though, because I was able to drill the hole the exact diameter of the rivet, which nicely locates this on the chassis. I just have a couple of clamps at the moment holding it in place. I did then have to cut the angles. So the end of this has 2 angles. This isn't sitting parallel to the ground, it's actually tipping up a little bit. It's about a 6-degree kick up. So I had to cut this vertically on that 6 degrees, and I also had to cut it on an angle this way to get these pieces to be parallel to each other. And the way this is going to work, I've very carefully measured everything to make sure everything is really square, really straight. So measuring diagonals as well as across the car and distances between things. Luckily there is the conveniently placed grease nipples in the top of the rear axles, because I've sort of mentioned this before, because this is on a torque tube which is pivoted at the back of the gearbox. This whole assembly goes up and down, which means these spring holders aren't tight. They're not gripping the axle tightly. It can rotate in those housings. That's why you have to grease them. But that gives me convenient places to measure diagonals. So I was able to go from there to the center of the tail on both sides and make sure that was the same. I was able to measure things like the distance between the brake rod and the back of that piece of timber, make sure that's the same on both sides. And I was able to make sure that the gap between this upright and this upright is the same. And I cut these temporary pieces of pine to make sure that was the case. Unfortunately, I don't have a clamp that's long enough to clamp from there to there. So the difficulty I'm going to have here is I need to glue and screw that bottom joint, and there's no way I can do that while it's on the car. So what I want to be able to do is glue it, but make sure it's clamped very tightly, because that gives you the strongest joint. So I need to figure out a way I can clamp that in place. Because I've got everything measured so well and cut accurately, this piece of timber that'll go in here, which forms the top of the axle opening, is just square on the ends, and the ends are just cut parallel because of the way I've arranged this so that these two are parallel. And you can see I've literally got a piece of string holding it all together at the moment. There's enough tension on the string that it's sort of pivoting around these middle boards, pulling on the top and pushing against the bottom, and it's enough to hold everything in place. The other thing I need to do is make sure there is enough clearance above here, because obviously this goes up and down. At the moment I've got this is set to about 4 inches of clearance. I'm not sure exactly what I need. With 4 inches, that puts this crossbar about halfway up the curve here. So that's kind of aesthetically pleasing, and usually if it looks right, it probably is right. The suspension on this is pretty stiff. I'm not sure you would get, if you got 4 inches of movement at the same time on both ends, you've probably been airborne. You'd be doing a Freddie Dixon into the rhubarb patch type maneuver, I think. But if the ground's a little bit rough, you could get articulation where one does come up 4 inches and the other one's dropping down, or something like that. So I need to find out exactly how much clearance there needs to be there. If it's not 4 inches, it's not going to be more than about 6, I'm sure. So that's kind of roughly in the ballpark. And usually it's about 7:30 in the evening now. I'm not actually going to screw anything together or assemble anything at the moment. Everything is just sort of sitting there loosely at the moment. And I will come back to it tomorrow probably and just recheck everything, have another look. I need to make the pieces there. Obviously that'll then be shaped around there. I need to make sure that these are vertical. So obviously you want that edge vertical, and I need to make sure that these are kind of in line with each other, which they should be. But you can see how tight everything is. So for example here, the shock absorber or the damper, friction damper, there's not a lot of clearance there. You know, it's everything's pretty tight on this car. The other thing I have done is that rear hoop. Obviously, again, I had to cut the bottom off it on a 6-degree angle, which is a bit tricky on a curve like that. I ended up doing it by hand. There was no way I could easily do it on the bandsaw. And then I very carefully sanded it on the linisher to get those flat. So again, the floor is pointing upwards at about 6 degrees, but obviously you want this vertical with the ground, and I think it's pretty close. That I should just be able to screw from the bottom. You can see actually trying to cut 2 flat angles, there's a little bit of a gap on that side, so I may need to epoxy that joint. Again, all of this gets reinforced with brackets through it and stuff, so I'm not too worried about that. I might have another try at sanding it. It's just really tricky to sand this completely flat so it doesn't rock, and that completely flat, but have them also both in plane effectively. It's a fiddly little job, but that gives you a pretty good idea of the shape of the tail of this thing now. You can see the profile in the shadow, which comes out quite nicely. It also shows me where the exhaust pipe comes to and where I'm going to need to shorten that so it's not sticking out too far. The other thing I could always do is I actually straightened this, so you can see it bent along and then straightened. I could have actually left it on an angle, which might have been better, but the problem then is it would have run too close to the chassis and it would be hard to actually make a hanger to hold it up. So I think it's better coming out straight. I prefer it being sort of straight. Might need a little tweak, and parallel to the springs. I think that's just an aesthetic thing, but yeah, getting a pretty good idea of the shape there. Obviously one way I can help make sure that these are parallel is do the same as I did on the front ones, which is I measured the distance from there to there and then marked my stick so that it had marks the exact same distance. So when that's just a temporary stick just to hold everything in place. I'll do the same here, and then if the distance at the bottom there is correct, and you use that stick on the top, the distance at the top is going to be the same. Then the only thing you have to make sure is that there isn't any racking, that if one of these is vertical, the other one has to be vertical because the dimensions are the same. But you have to make sure they're not both tipped on an angle like that. The other way I can do that is draw a center line in the middle of my sticks, which matches the center line I've got going all the way down the middle of the car. It's all pretty close. So I think that's where I'm going to finish tonight. So it's actually a work day today, but we're having an off-site meeting, and we're using one of the meeting rooms here at Southwoods Museum. My colleagues have only just left the city, so that'll take another 50 minutes to get here. So I've kind of got the entire museum to myself at the moment. I don't think there's anyone else here at all. But this is local to me, so I've got a sort of annual pass, so I just come here as often as I want. Just come here, wander around for some inspiration. They've only got one Riley, which is kind of down in there somewhere, but lots of other interesting cars. I'm not going to bother filming it. I think I've done a few of them before, but there are other people who have done tours around here. Definitely worth coming to though. This might be interesting for Randy. There's some Model Ts here, and if you look at them, you notice they're all right-hand drive ones. I don't really know anything about these things at all.